All right, we are on air. You're good to go.
All right, thank you, Stephanie. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for taking the time out of your day and the time out of your evening to attend tonight. My name is Corey Miller, and I am a planner with the City of Golden. And I'm happy to introduce this presentation and meeting to you tonight. I think that I speak also for all of our planning staff and our consultant team as well when I say that we are excited for the ability to finally get to release this new zoning concept to you for review. I know that there are several within the community that are also eager to get their hands on this new zoning concept to provide feedback. And that's encouraging. We know that there are a lot within the community that want this project to succeed to the best of its ability. And so we encourage feedback, not just tonight with our question and answer period, which will come after our presentation, but also through the next several weeks. And we'll go over at the end of the presentation ways in which you can provide feedback and stay in contact throughout those upcoming weeks. But before we get into the main presentation, I want to personally say that I feel that the new concept that we're going to release tonight, this new draft of our zoning code, represents a culmination of a conversation about zoning code analysis, zoning code tweaking, and potentially updating our code in various ways that has been ongoing since I've joined the City of Golden, which will be 3 years this upcoming summer. But I know that you know that conversation has been going on for much longer than that. And it really goes back to our Golden Vision 2030 policy, which was adopted several years ago. For those of you who may not know, our zoning code, which represents our zoning law, which indicates where you can construct different types of uses around the city, but also the manner in which those uses can be constructed, is a document that predates our Golden Vision 2030 policy. And that's an issue, a pretty big issue, because that public outreach process was a monumental achievement for the City of Golden. Several different policies, goals, and visions were established as part of that policy that influence all of our policy documents, and among other things, indicate how the community of Golden would like the buildings, the future buildings, to integrate into the established built environment within the City of Golden. I feel that if there's a disconnect, it's important that we address it, as all of you do as well. And I'm excited, as I mentioned, to tell you that I feel that I think that this new zoning concept goes a long way into succeeding in that manner. Figure out how to change slides. Here we go. So we have a full presentation for you tonight. We have information about how you can get involved with Guiding Golden and the review of the zoning code chapter. At the end of the presentation, we'll also have a question and answer period. So I would ask if you could hold your questions until the end of the meeting. Before that, though, staff would like to give you a brief history of how we got to where we are today, from Golden Vision up until the point where we felt that we would release a request to hire a consultant to help us update our zoning documentation. I'd like to provide you with some information about the early phases of the rewrite when it was known as the diagnostic phase, and then finally provide you with some updates to the schedule moving forward. At that point, I will transfer it over to our consultant team from Helena, Peter Park Planning, and Meta Urban Design, who will go over the various facets of the zoning code, the methodology that was used to study the built environment of the community and the history of the built environment within the community, the different individual parts of the draft that we're releasing tonight, and then finally a step-by-step method for looking at this new zoning code that will hopefully put you on your best foot forward when you enter the review phase. But to begin, I would like to hand it over to Mr. Rick Morby, who is our planning manager and acting community development director, who will then provide a brief synopsis of, as I said, how we got to where we are today. So with that, go ahead, Rick.
Thank you, Corey. Thank you very much. Again, I'm Rick Muraby. I'm the planning manager and the acting director of the department. And I'm going to walk you through a little of how we decided to initiate this process and why we went about it the way we did. And so, as Corey mentioned earlier, Golden Vision 2030 is sort of the root of it all, right? It's I think most are aware that this process, this 2-year community engagement process, was very important to the community. It was completed in 2010, and it's really set the tone for our policy documents ever since. And the essence of Golden Vision 2030 is an agreed upon set of values that are shown here. They guide community decision-making processes. So we wanted to have our zoning code rewrite rooted in that same set of values. So when it comes to land use policy in particular, it's the comprehensive plan, it's the neighborhood plans, and it's even the transportation master plans that are all stemming from this Golden Vision 2030 document in that process. Next slide, please. However, over the past few years, it's become apparent to us that our zoning code was not in touch with our guiding policy documents. We had a series of unpopular infill development projects that led to sometimes contentious public hearings at Planning Commission and Council. When these projects were reviewed by staff and found to be compliant with zoning, and then they were approved by Commission for the same reason, a number of residents were asking how the site plan could meet these legal zoning requirements if it was, differed so much from the goals and the policies that were in our comprehensive plan and our Golden Vision values. So, people told us when they read these plans, they had a vision of the type of development that should be occurring, but what was getting approved was really outside of that and out of sync with that vision. So staff and community members and some counselors started talking about the physical character of our different neighborhoods and how to preserve that look and feel. And most really did not think it appropriate to control design specifically, but there was a kind of a common consensus around the scale of new development and how that should be controlled, when you think of bulk and massing. And so what the zoning code currently allows was just really not compatible with what was already there, the existing built environment. And so it was really tearing at the fabric of our neighborhoods, and we knew we needed to do something about it. Next slide, please. So after these conversations in late 2018 and early 2019, staff and Planning Commission held a series of public meetings to address these issues of scale and massing in new construction. And we specifically focused on the R2 and R3 multifamily zoning districts because that's where a lot of this was occurring, these issues that were coming up about bulk and character and context. This later led to a set of new regulations that are adopted currently that limit the bulk plane of existing structures, and that's really along the side property lines. And if you think of a typical lot in these areas, you go to the side property line, you go up 15 feet, and you draw an imaginary 45-degree angle, and that really creates the envelope for where a building could go. And so this did help with the problem. It did provide more relief for neighboring properties, more sky, more sun, but we knew that wouldn't be enough. We knew that these measures would help address the problem, but we also knew they were fairly blunt instruments. Even controlling for lot coverage and adding front porches. Again, they helped, but they didn't address it in a real comprehensive way. And that's when we started talking about overhauling the code. And that code is, as Corey mentioned, is several decades old. We've been patching it and updating it over the years, but it's really getting time to overhaul it. And so that was our new direction and our new goal. And in 2019, if you can switch to the next slide, Council agreed at that time to fund a consultant team to help us address our zoning code issues. And staff initiated an RFP process to find that expertise that was needed to do that. This is really a specialty role. We knew we also needed to conduct an audit of our existing code, which has been called the Diagnostic to date, and will be referred to that way later in the presentation. But that really determines what was and wasn't working in the code, and what we needed to do to focus on for the rewrite process. So this research and analysis phase was built into the RFP, and it was also part of our overall process here. We also know there were some important goals that we needed to achieve with this zoning code overhaul. First and foremost was aligning the zoning code with those community values and those policy documents that I've referred to. We needed to create rules that require new development to be in context and character with the established community. In other words, the new construction should fit with the old construction and contribute to that character. And we needed a zoning code that was easier to use. We want images and explanations, and also offer predictability for everyone. I think that was a failing of our current zoning code. And so all of these are lofty goals, but that's what we went into with this process. We knew we couldn't afford to address everything in Title 18. It's a big section of code. We have a limited budget, so we put our emphasis on some key areas in the update process. And those are namely Chapter 1828, which is where you find those use and bulk and setback standards, but also Chapter 1840, which is the site development regulations and review process. So those two chapters are very large in scope, but it was also assumed that staff was going to be addressing the other areas of the code in conjunction with this as well as after this process. But we wanted to put our budget and our consultants on the efforts that would make the most difference in the outcomes for the community. So that's how we got here, and I'll hand it back to Corey. I think he's going to start walking you through the process that occurred today.
Thank you, Rick. So we knew pretty early in the process from the staff level with our conversations with the community, but also City Council, that we needed to bring in the professional opinions and review of planning professionals that were experienced in this type of code analysis and code update. And again, as Rick mentioned, this idea of analyzing how your community wants to grow and determining whether or not your current zoning law is capable of generating that type of development. And I'm happy to admit that we have some of the foremost names when it comes to this type of analysis working for us as part of this code update. And their reputations extend far beyond the borders of Colorado. But to answer that question, these consultants had to do a lot of research. And so the first half of this code rewrite was really a diagnosis phase, we call the diagnostic phase, that began in 2019 and stretched into the early part of 2020. So as they began to look at sort of that question, can your code generate the types of developments people want to see? They analyzed our current code book for basic things like legibility and navigation, but they also took special care to look at our policy documents and see what types of goals and strategies the community had put forth as far as the built environment was concerned. The issue is, though, when you open up the Golden Vision 2030 document, or by extension, our comprehensive plan, you're introduced to a lot of terms that mean very specific things to the community of Golden, but can be somewhat nebulous to an outsider like these professionals coming in. So a lot of time was taken to interview various members of the community, several members of the community, which we called stakeholder interviews, where we invited in residents, members of the business community, professional users of the code, our local architects who have used our code, who use other codes and can provide a one-to-one comparison. And also city councilors, planning commissioners, and several others to talk about, what it means to define small town character and some of these other terms that we find in our comprehensive plan and Vision 2030 document. And try to sort of bridge that gap into, okay, I see what you're saying in your policy documents, but how is that reflected in the built environment? So the other half of this process involved a lot of footwork. Our consultants analyzed several properties within the community of Golden. They walked the streets, they pound the pavement, so to speak. And again, with the goal of marrying this idea of concept provided by the policy documents and what is actually the physical condition on the ground. And so once that process was completed, they created a list of key issues that they thought needed to be addressed in order to bring our zoning code up to a standard that would allow it to generate small town character, as an example. And they housed these issues within a document called the Diagnostic Report, which is available on Guiding Golden if you'd like to download it and read it. But before they took this document to City Council, the city formed a task force, which we called the Zoning Rewrite Task Force, or the ZRTF, which was comprised of members of those stakeholder groups, community members, city councilors, planning commissioners, professional users of the code, etc. And they analyzed the Diagnostic Report first to ensure that those issues were succinct with the conversations they had with the consultants, and also the knowledge they brought to the table of the greater community, their neighbors, their constituents, who are able to sort of vocalize the issues that they see around the city of Golden. That document was presented to Planning Commission, City Council in the early summer of 2020. They analyzed the key issues and they agreed, and they allowed us to move forward with the rewrite process. So in the early summer, when the rewrite process began, the planning rewrite team sort of broke up into two groups. Staff handled a very large-scale public outreach process where we created several surveys that were housed on Guiding Golden for the community to participate in. We created a separate platform called the Golden Building Blocks Project that asked the community to walk around their neighborhoods, take pictures of things and elements of the built environment that they felt contributed to the look and feel of Golden. We had these surveys up for several months over the summer. We did a big notification campaign with signs, social media, through the newspaper, as well as a notification in the water bill to try to get as many people activated to the fact that we are updating our zoning code and we want to hear your feedback. All the time that this was happening, the consultant team was meeting with our ZRTF group to talk about those key issues and to try to develop them into concepts and solutions that would be integrated into the new zoning code. They met with the ZRTF 5 separate times in paired meetings, so really they met about 10 times. Those meetings concluded at the end of October, where we had a community meeting to talk about how we felt the issues within the diagnostic report could be addressed. And then the consultants went into production phase and production mode and generated the zoning code draft that we're releasing tonight. So I'm about ready to turn over the control of the PowerPoint presentation to our consultants. But before I do, I want to talk about what's remaining in the schedule as far as the consultants are concerned, what's left for them to help us out with. And the schedule that was approved by City Council at the beginning of the summer has changed a little bit as far as the duration, some of the time periods associated with the items, but the basic tasks have remained the same. And we're finding ourselves right now at sort of the 3/4 mark as far as the schedule is concerned, which I've circled with this orange circle for this community meeting. At which point we will engage in a public outreach campaign, and we will gather feedback, we will gather insight, and we'll provide that information to City Council and Planning Commission. They'll host a joint study session with our consultants, and they'll talk about what the next steps are as far as a second draft is concerned. The consultants will help us generate a second draft, but then they'll hand that over to us and the process over to city staff to complete the zoning code rewrite. And I think that's important to note because I know there's some confusion associated with this schedule. It sort of looks like once this handoff occurs, it will be reviewed by City Council and that'll be the end of the process. But that simply can't happen because there are so many different elements of our overall municipal code that need to be updated so that all of these elements speak clearly to one another. You'll get a little taste of that now when we release this new draft. City staff has gone through and updated the zoning use section of the code. It used to be sort of lists of uses associated with new zone districts. We've put it into a table to try to make it a little bit more legible, more user-friendly. We haven't really done anything as far as adjust which uses are permitted in which zone districts. That has remained, largely the same. It's just a way of cleaning things up a bit. But we will also need to take a look at our subdivision standards. You'll see some new types of land configurations associated with this new zoning code. We have to make sure that that is succinct. We need to overhaul our application procedures, our mapping tools, so that the digital experience with analyzing the zoning code, figuring out where your property is and what you're permitted to do is the most user-friendly as possible. We know that the Historic Preservation Board is working with staff to possibly update their regulations. We need to make sure that their process is married with this zoning rewrite process. And there's a new sustainability approach that is being introduced this year as well. There could be additional items that come out during our engagement process that we need to address. So I just want to, sell you on the fact that the consultants are contracted to do a set amount of tasks, but when they step away, it's still very much a project that is alive. And so much than the fact that we don't have a set date on when we think that this plan or this new zoning code will eventually be adopted. But to give you sort of a micro level look at what we have left for the first half of the year, we have our meeting tonight. We then, over the course of February, release the draft to the public for review. And we, as I mentioned, have some outlets on Guiding Golden for you to take advantage of in that regard. In March, we are planning to have a joint study session with Planning Commission and Council to review those comments. And then we anticipate a second draft from our consultants sometime in the summer. But again, we aren't yet ready to say when the plan will be adopted because we feel that there is a great amount of work and potential outreach that needs to occur before then. So I've spoken enough, and at this point, I would like to turn it over to our consultants who will tell you about our new code. So at this point, I would like to introduce Mr. Peter Park, who will give you a little bit of information about sort of the methodology that went into analyzing the built environment from the city and how that influenced the new code.
Stephanie, may I share the screen? Okay. Is this full screen now? Okay.
Yes. Thank you, Corkett. Good evening, everyone. I'm Peter Park. I'm just going to provide a little bit of an introduction of the work, and particularly focusing on what are some really important foundation points for this work. Next slide, please. And it has to do with this notion of a city evolving, right? I mean, this was in the 1850s and 1890s. This is the part of Golden that got developed, right, here in the orange. And next slide, please. And, you know, the layout of the city, the street grid along the water's edge, kind of followed this diagonal grid up until the 30s, but then you begin to see some evolution and development happening outside that original sort of traditional core. Next slide. And so for those of you who didn't know, your first zoning code was adopted in 1949. So we're sort of looking at the world before the zoning code was first established in 1949 and after. And before the zoning code in 1949, a lot of really nice neighborhoods and a lot of nice buildings got developed, got built. And there was no code, there was no zoning, there was anything really controlling it. It was just the way people used to make really great places. And in that 1949 code, there were 5 zone districts. Next slide, please. And in subsequent years, from the late 40s to about the mid 70s, some adjustments to the code came in. So, for example, in 56, there was a minimum lot frontage. You needed at least 60 feet for a residential lot, and you needed at least 6,000 square feet. In 1960, there was an additional 6 districts added. And by 1973, there was another amendment that increased the minimum size of a residential lot. Now, this is in keeping with trends that were happening in the Denver metro area, in the state of Colorado, in the United States, of bigger houses, bigger lots, and the regulations were actually tracking with this idea that if someone were to build a new single-family house, it needed a minimum of at least 6,000 square feet or a minimum of 7,000 square feet, even though the older parts of the city didn't quite meet those requirements. And we'll get back to that. So next slide, please. In 95 and 93, there was some other adjustments, but as Rick said earlier, 2010 marks a pretty significant point where you've been living with this code for 60-some years, and you weren't always getting the results that you wanted. The discussion around Vision 2030 reoriented the perspective about what kind of future did you imagine for yourselves, and ideas about what's the community character and the small town character of Golden. Next slide. And since then, a number of other amendments, no, not just ADUs and chickens, but efforts to look in 2012, reducing the residential minimum lot frontages. So in the first code, there were standards that in the post-World War II era up to the mid-70s were sort of increasing. And then in 2012, you started going back. And in fact, some of the changes that you've been enacting recently are really going back to do what? To actually legalize the original form of the city. And this is part of the problem that Golden has, but every city has these situations where the old parts of the city, because remember, in 1949, maybe a lot of folks in 1949 thought, you know, those buildings that were built in the early 1900s or the late 1800s, they're old, they're not modern. And what we want to be is a modern city. So we need to change our laws because those old buildings are not going to last. And we're going to replace them with more desirable outcomes. Well, they are really quite nice buildings. Many of them has lasted longer, even the buildings that were built in the 70s. And the perspective and your community values are really pointing to protecting that traditional character of the community. Reiterated in the comp plan, reiterated in some other frontage requirement and setback changes that Rick mentioned. So that brought us to 2019, where we started and Corey's introduction began. So, well, what about this history? Well, here's what's really important. Here's where, next slide, please. Here's where we looked very deeply at these patterns relative to the eras of development. So from the 1850s to the 1930s, and we identified what we call contexts from the downtown and the traditional parts of the city, the original parts of the city, because they have a particular pattern to them. And you can see, next slide, please, that as the city grew, and so these patterns are typically of the grid and alleys of the downtown blocks and the near downtown neighborhoods, core neighborhoods as we might refer to them, and then the first sort of new neighborhoods that were built on the edges of downtown. But they're still sort of traditional patterns of the relationship of the buildings, and scale of buildings, and their relationship to the street. Next slide, please. And so there we were with the original downtown and traditional neighborhoods. Next slide. And then as the town grew, there were different patterns that evolved in the 40s, next slide, and to commercial areas in the more suburban parts of the city, right? And so we also chronicled those. Next slide, please. And those have different patterns. Sometimes they're cul-de-sacs. Sometimes they are, there's no alley, right? Sometimes, right, there's a different pattern, and they typically are more automobile-oriented, right? And so under your current code, the zones don't really distinguish these different characteristics, the physical characteristics of the city, and don't recognize the different eras of a city that was originally very walkable before automobiles were a significant influence on city form, and then the patterns that you get in parts of the city that are very dependent on automobiles. Next slide. So as Rick mentioned, these are in the diagnostic, and if you're interested, you could read a little bit more detail about these neighborhood contexts and how they're described. And those became the starting point of the analysis on the code and what we're going to present to you tonight in terms of how that code and that thinking has evolved from these early observations. But I just want to wrap up with two more slides. Next slide, please. So the fundamental thing is that when we look at that downtown and traditional neighborhood context, right, and the neighborhoods that were built up to the 1930s, when you look at the zoning, right, so R2 and R3, and properties that are non-conforming, right, next slide, please, what you find out is a lot of those areas, so things that are lighting up in red, are single family that are non-conforming, that is, they don't meet the minimum lot standards, even after the adjustment, or duplexes in the slightly darker red. Right. This is fundamentally a kind of an evidence of the problem is these homes in 1949 were not considered to be the future of Golden. But now you see that actually your history and your future are embodied in these kind of beautiful structures. But the code has not been updated to look upon them to say, oh yeah, that's a perfectly reasonable way to build. In fact, that's what we want, is we want buildings to fit better into the neighborhood. And so this is kind of the backstory, if you will, of what's happening in terms of what are some of the causes of the challenges that you have in your code today. And we hope that this helps set the stage for what's being proposed as a solution and a different approach to codes. And with that, I'd like to hand it over to Korkut.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. This is very exciting for us. I'm going to start talking about the findings of the diagnostic report first, and then go into explain what we're presenting, what we're including in the first draft. So we have the substance, process, and navigation. In terms of the substance, there are three important items. The community character. As Peter just mentioned, that the best parts of the city loved by a lot of people, the current code and the properties of those environments clash. There are some mismatches, and therefore you saw the nonconformities. And the code cannot reproduce or regenerate some of those qualities that are loved by everybody. And then there are some incompatibility problems that are There are some of the new developments, new buildings, in terms of the scale, size, and character, clash with the context. So the way we identify this, we interviewed, we heard about frustration of certain projects, then we went out there, looked at the projects, looked at the neighborhood, and tried to understand what parts of the code permitted that particular example and why that particular example has a problem with the context. Therefore, we look at the context. And like Peter said, we really try to understand the differences between contexts and really identify the elements in the code that create that undesirable outcome that clashes with the context. So that, community character mismatch and incompatibility are really interrelated with each other. And I'm going to go back to those and explain what has been our approach. We heard a lot about the frustration about the process as well. There's Golden is unique in the amount of discretionary processes, review processes employed. And we realized that, in spite of the fact that there's a lot of process, there's a lot of frustration as well from all parties. The reviewers, the commission are frustrated because they are complaining about the code. Our hands are tied because code allows that. The residents, public is frustrated because in spite of the fact that they raise their opinions again because of the code, they're not heard, and the developers complain because it's a lot of uncertainty and long process. So our approach to that is that maybe there's a way to create by right options we all agree that would create better environments, more satisfactory outcomes, and therefore we don't need to overload the process. The discretionary review would deal with special cases where some unforeseen elements create some difficulties in applying the existing the regulations. Therefore, you need to really discuss discretionary. One other category of problems is related with the way the code is arranged. It's not very user-friendly, we heard. A lot of the time, the information you need is dispersed, and you think you know everything that affects your property, and then you find out some other elements somewhere else. So we realized that there should be some kind of shuffling in the code that makes it much easier for the user. In the past, there were different paradigms, and the idea that code should be user-friendly for the layperson was not very shared in the profession. It's getting more so that we're creating more user-friendly codes, and I'm going to talk about that soon as well. And again, like Rick mentioned, we look at all these problems and identify the issues with the code, keeping in mind the overarching objectives stated by the policy documents, the comprehensive plan, Vision 2030, etc., and the neighborhood plans. And Rick explained these, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time. So, what do we mean by the draft? We're not really rewrote the whole code. We shuffled certain things, and we're releasing 3 documents. One is the use regulations. It's a chapter. 28, 29 is building form regulations, and this is a 100-page document. And that's the bulk of our studies. And then there's the landscaping and open space standards and guidelines. So these 3 documents somehow took a lot of the dispersed information, changed and revised, and put into 3 documents. There's a map what we call building form zones map, and I'll explain what that is, and a current copy, a copy of the current code with deleted items. That is to say, whenever we rewrote certain parts or carry it to these three chapters, we delete it. And we're kind of showing scratch text in this particular document so that you can see what parts of the code changed and what parts of the code we didn't work on. And like Corey said, it's an ongoing process, and it has developed in 70 years. Different parts evolved in certain ways, so it takes a lot of time to bring it together and make it more consistent. But we believe that this is a big step forward. So, why do we have use and form in different chapters? Let's talk about that. What is use and what is form? When we say use, residential, commercial, etc., and then form is what you see in the buildings. It's a house, it's a cottage, and duplex, etc., so forth. Current code mixes these. It says these are the uses permitted, and then list duplex, 4-unit, multifamily. That is that a form or is that a use? Use is residential. So when you imply that certain uses need to go with certain forms, you're really restricting your flexibility, because we know that, in terms of the use, there's some flexibility. Maybe there's a cottage built as a residential, but now it's occupied by a dentist or a coffee house. We see these kind of formations a lot. That is, you look at the neighborhood, the context, it's pretty much commercial, limited residential, but it looks like cottagey. So to understand the complexity of that kind of environment, we kind of look at form and use separately. So, and then in terms of the form, the idea is that one size doesn't fit all. When you look at the current zoning code, for all the houses, single family, detached, there's one envelope, setbacks and height. Well, if a building is 3,000 square feet, which is a very different thing than, let's say, a tiny little cottage, 1,200 square feet. It needs different treatment. It needs different kind of set of rules and setbacks and such. That's the reason why we think we need to provide more options in terms of the form. And that's our approach. And that's why that form section is pretty lengthy. So Peter mentioned about these context types, different neighborhoods developed in time, therefore they have different characters. In order to really address those characters and really provide a set of options that can be compatible with those contexts, we approach the city form in terms of different form zones. So what we're saying is that the current zone districts, the residential 1, residential 2, commercial, etc., so forth, can stay as they are, but they control only the use of the land. On top of that, we bring another layer, 9 zones that control the form. So the zones that control the use are different than the building form zones. What does that mean? Well, I'm going to get into those very quickly. So, like I said, 9 building form zones, some neighborhoods and some corridors. And if you zoom into this map is provided, you're going to see that the colors represent these form zones, but the use districts are coded as well. The first letter you see there refers to the form. The second is the residential. So what does that mean? Here is your current zoning map, and these are the use districts. The orange you're seeing there is R3, residential 3. What we realized there, that even though there's a big orange, not every part of that orange is the same in terms of the building character, the neighborhood character. There's the core, where there's much more consistency between the buildings. There are smaller buildings, more traditional, and as you go towards out the transition, and then the edge, you have bigger buildings, more diverse. So a building that is permitted in the peripheral area at the edge may not be compatible in the core, because core is much more consistent. So approaching this and saying that one envelope covers this whole area creates problems in terms of the compatibility. That's how we saw that, maybe we need to differentiate these areas. And that's the reason why we're saying that in our form map, there's the core. We need to be much more careful about the core, and more stringent, smaller buildings don't permit, larger buildings. And then there's the transition, maybe slightly larger, and then you go to the edge, and there's an outer edge where bigger buildings. So, maybe a 4-unit row home is compatible in certain contexts, in the edge environment, but it may be too big and too contrasting in the core area because there aren't any such buildings in that core area. So when you bring something that is not there, it really creates the clash. That is the reason why we're saying that, let's develop these different form zones and permit different things in these. There's another interesting district here. As you can see, this particular color, that's called neighborhood corridor. For instance, there's, in that particular, that's the Ford and, corridor. In terms of the use, there are commercial uses permitted there. But the way the current code interpreted that, if it is commercial, it needs to be Main Street building type. That is to say, you need to have a building right on the sidewalk with significant presence. But when you look at that context, you have smaller buildings, cottagey, et cetera, so forth. And like I was saying that, there's a dentist, there's an accountant in a cottage, et cetera, so forth. But in terms of the building character, it still has that small town cottage character, even though the use permitted is commercial. So that's why we're saying that, hey, wait a minute, that particular neighborhood corridor should have the cottagey character. It's not your typical Main Street area. It's not your typical commercial. In order any building to be compatible, if you put a Main Street building there, it's going to be clashing. And there are some examples, and we heard a lot of frustration about those examples. And the reason is that you're bringing a building that is very foreign to that environment, assuming that it's commercial, it has to be this way. So that's how we're approaching. That is to say, that is a very special kind of a form district, and it should be carefully calibrated to what is permitted there. And then we have the Main Street A, Main Street B, those are downtown areas, and then the strip, your typical, strip development. But there are ways to tame that and make it more appealing and pedestrian friendly. We'll go to those as well. Going forward, so 9 building form types, 9 building form zones, and there are 44 building form types in this section. And, there are the cottages, compounds. I'll talk about what those are, the duplexes, triplex, row homes, apartments, etc., so forth. How does this work? For each building form zone, a set of these form types are permitted. This is an example of the core, for instance, the first building form zone. There are certain houses, certain cottages, compounds, clusters, duplexes are permitted. Those are permitted in this particular form zone. And as you can see, there's nothing big there. We don't have row homes there. And that's the reason. The reason is that that's the most vulnerable and most cottagey context. But again, in spite of the fact that we're limiting, there are a lot of options at the same time. So very quickly, the building forms section, I'm going to go through the outline, how it is organized very quickly so that you can orient yourself there. It starts with introducing the building form zones. What is the context, what are the characteristics of the context, and what's the permitted form types within that context. So, and then there are different sections. For the whole building form section, there are rules and measurements and definitions. I'll explain what those are soon. And then for each category, there's an introduction, talks about the tools used in that particular section. And then you have the types, suburban, site drive house, village house, etc., so forth. And then some standards and guidelines that is particularly for the houses. Now, in terms of the categories, we have houses, cottages, compounds, clusters, duplexes, row houses, main street buildings, apartment buildings, and shops. That means every one of these have an introduction explaining the possibilities, the tools, and every one of these has a standards and guidelines section. And then finally, some review processes, variances, compliance, and conformities section at the end. So that's the building form chapter. Okay, the beginning of this chapter starts with how to use this code. We're saying that there are 6 steps for designing your building in Golden using section 1829. So I'm going to go through those steps and orient you, hopefully, to the code much better that way. So first thing you need to do is find out which form zone you are in, your property is in. And this is the map, you can do that. And again, like I said, it also gives you the use district at the same time. And then go to that context, understand what the properties of that context. This happened to be neighborhood corridor building form zone. There's a description, just general characteristics. And then the building form types permitted within that zone. Just to zoom in what those are. Oops, I went too far. Just to zoom in, again, there are several houses, cottages, compounds, clusters. I'll talk what they are, duplexes, triplexes, etc., so forth. And that's the list that is permitted in the particular form zone. Then there's the section you need to, this is kind of like a rules of measurements and definitions, but at the same time, it's user manual. This is what we're trying to do. And this came from the task force. We were designing, crafting some regulations, and then, explaining why they are and what they do. And, task force told us that, when you explain, it makes sense. Why don't you include these explanations in the code and make it much more user-friendly? And that was the time we realized that, hey, we keep talking about user-friendliness. Why don't we make this like a user manual at the same time? Really not only explain what the rules are and how you measure it, but also what you can do with them. So there's a definition here, building form type. This is a typical page on the right-hand side of a form type. You have the regulations, the height, lot coverage, setbacks, and other requirements. There's a visual 3D and a plan and general explanation. So that is the reason why it's good to, before getting into the details, going in through this particular section, because it really familiarizes it really helps you to familiarize with the tools this code uses. And then let's say you're interested in cottages. You're gonna, you have a lot and you're trying to figure out what your options in terms of the cottages are. The cottages category starts with an introduction where really explains why certain tools are used and what are they supposed to do. For instance, in this particular case, we're showing that, there are some really shallow lots provided in the code. What do you do with those shallow lots? Well, maybe you have a very deep lot. This is actually an existing lot. We don't disclose where it is, but it's a good example. So we're giving examples in this particular section, saying that this is how you can use those small lot, shallow lots, by subdividing a large lot into these and then providing a common chord, which is something I'm going to talk about soon. And then number 5, you go to your particular cottage pages and pick one and understand what you can do with those. And finally, go to the standards and understand what other standards are applied. So again, going through the 6 steps, what is the building form zone? What is permitted within that zone in terms of the building form types, the list of it. Then the general rules of measurements and definitions section. Then, depending on the category, if you're interested in house, you're interested in row houses, go to the row house section. What is the introduction? What are the, some tools used? And then look at the form types and select the form type, and then go to the standards. So that's the 6 items you go through to use this particular section. So again, about our approach. Here you're seeing a 4-unit row home with some 3rd story. And, this building may be appropriate in certain contexts, because in those particular contexts, let's say edge collocations, let's say some peripheral areas, there are buildings like this size and this fits well. But there are some other parts of the Golden that this may be too big and too clashy compared with what you're seeing here. It's, 1.5-story cottages. Now, when you compare these though, again, in terms of the development rights, we're not trying to restrict the development completely, but give options, comparable options in terms of the development. So what you're seeing on the left-hand side, the row home is currently permitted in a lot of the districts in Golden, but this is not permitted. The cottage cluster is not permitted because each new lot needs to have a street frontage. As you can see here, the 3 lots at the rear, they don't have a street frontage. We're saying that we need to create this, and that is the reason why we define something called common chord. What you're seeing here in darker green is called common chord. And the definition of it has some standards, dimensional standards, especially if it's going to count as the frontage. And then we're permitting some new lots to have only common chord frontage, but not the street frontage. Now, Golden has an amazing opportunity in most of the established neighborhoods. The lots are pretty deep. 140 is a very common depth. And when you have 140 depth, then the rear of the lot can be used in different ways, in creative ways. And that's why this cluster is especially very convenient for Golden, because of the deep lots, and especially realistic. But the regulatory framework needs to permit A, smaller lots, and B, lots that have only common chord frontage, not street frontage. So that's why we're feeling that, in terms of the square footage, total floor area on this lot is comparable with this. But since they had to have frontage, you have limited frontages, and all the building came to the street. And again, it may be a fine building in certain contexts, but it may be not fine in other contexts. And in terms of the amount of people living on these lots are comparable, but we believe that the cluster fits certain contexts much better than what you're seeing on the left-hand side. And again, it depends on the context. And that's why we have 9 building form zones. So this is more like a core, this is more like an edge, so to speak, in those. So, and actually, this is permitted in the edge, and actually, outer edge has bigger buildings permitted, but none of that is permitted in the core neighborhood. Here's another concept, what we call compound. We had a lot of discussion about the term. The term implies some fortification. That's not what we want to imply. The reason we use this term is because it refers to a single lot. That is to say, a lot with multiple ADUs, ancillary dwelling units. And again, what we're saying is that in many cases, the current code permits pretty large buildings. And it's interesting. I mean, we looked at the current code and we realized that, first of all, as the lot size grows, building size can grow according to current code. And in some cases, we realize that you can really have 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 square feet houses. It hasn't happened yet, and maybe it will not happen, but, different parts of the Denver, especially Boulder, we see those kind of really big houses coming in. And they really clash with the existing neighborhood, because it doesn't matter how big of a lot. If in a neighborhood you don't have such large buildings, 4,000 square to 5,000 square, it doesn't matter how big of the lot. Once you put that building in that neighborhood, it's going to clash. So that's why we're bringing this idea of controlling the size of the building. That is to say, there is a maximum floor area permitted in different form types. And, 3,000 square feet, 3,200 square feet are the two numbers these house types are using in the core area, for instance. And the reason we are so confident with that is that, like I said, we heard complaints, we went to the context, we looked at the physical environment, and then we went back to the code. And what we saw, for instance, in R2, the residential 2 neighborhood, I don't remember the exact numbers, but around 200 total dwelling units, there were only 3 dwelling units that are higher than 3,000 square feet. So with that kind of survey, we kind of are confident that maybe, that's the size. But more important than what that number is, we believe that there should be a limit of the size. But then you turn around and say, by the way, there are other ways to appreciate the value and provide options. And this is one of them. Create a 3-cottage compound. There's in larger lots, 4-cottage compound. That is to say, you can have multiple buildings, but smaller buildings. And, in this particular case, for instance, the number we are appreciating, none of these cottages can have more than 1,400 square feet. That's the number we put in the code for the time being, and we like to hear from you. But what that does is that even though you may have multiple, the way you're going to perceive this particular lot from the street is going to be 1.5-story small cottage. And that fits the scale. And since the lots are pretty deep, you can appreciate and provide options. And that's another important element of this, is that once you do these kind of small multiple buildings, you really increase the affordability. And, that's another, attainability is another objective of the policy documents. That is to say, diversify the housing market and really respond to the demand. And interestingly enough, there's a demand for smaller units, and only thing the market offers for smaller units are small apartments in the apartmentsville. You go to a big complex of 200 apartments, and that's the only option. There's very limited option in terms of these kind of contexts for smaller units. That's another item we're trying to incorporate. That's the gist of it. There's much more, of course, in terms of the detail in the code, but it takes time, and we all still digesting, and we would like to have a lot of input from you. And in a limited time, it's really hard to get into all the details, but like I said, we try to be as explanatory and user-friendly as possible with the language of the code. Thanks.
Okay, thank you a lot, Korkut. Stephanie, could I have control of the screen? Thank you. Before we jump into our Q&A, ladies and gentlemen, I want to give you a brief rundown of how we've updated our Guiding Golden page and give you some avenues to respond to us, to provide direct feedback as we release this code for review. As I mentioned, from now throughout the month of February and into the beginning of March, we have uploaded a draft of this code, the different sections that Korkut has described, to Guiding Golden for you to download. And we're hoping that you take the opportunity to research it, analyze it, and then, as I say, provide feedback. When you go to the main City of Golden Zoning Code Update page, which used to look much different, but as I mentioned, has been overhauled, you'll be greeted with these 4 tiles on the right-hand side of the page. These are the different sections that Korkut and Peter went over. We have, if I can move my WebEx box out of the way, the use regulations, which again are the land uses that are permitted within our standard zone districts. As Korkut mentioned, we have a new concept called building form zones, and there's a map that he went over to explain that, where those areas are located. The uses are still regulated by our standard zone districts. So you might have the R2 zone district with our standard uses permitted, but within the R2 zone district, you have different sub areas that permit different building forms. This is the map that shows you where the building forms, where the building form zones are located. And then you have the big chapter, the chapter that Korkut was presenting to you, the form zones and building form types. We're calling it 1829. It will be a new chapter within Title 18. And then last but not least, our landscaping regulations. As Korkut mentioned as well, we have a strike-through version of the current code in the Document Center that you can download if you are curious as to what has been relocated into the new Chapter 1829 and what still remains. Now, with that being said, how can you communicate with us? Every week, City staff is going to host virtual office hours on Thursdays from 4 to 5 p.m. This is a recurring meeting, meaning that when you click on this, it'll take you to a link to join a WebEx discussion like this, where you can come in the community and ask whatever questions that you might have, gain any clarifications that you might need as you review the code. And again, you just have to click on this button and it'll take you directly to the link, and that will be every week through March 4th. And if we need more time, we'll discuss extending it. And then in addition to that, we have different tool options located towards the bottom of the sheet, the bottom of the page, which allow you to provide direct feedback in a forum setting. You can respond directly to comments made by your constituents and neighbors. You can thumbs up comments, thumbs down comments, and add your own ideas. We provided 4 of these, and we provided 3 based on topics that we think might be the hottest sort of issues that people want to discuss. We have one dedicated to the building form zones, in other words, the map. Maybe you're reviewing the documentation and you're analyzing the different neighborhoods and you're like, you know what? I feel like there might be a discrepancy where the boundary of this form zone is laying, and maybe we can make an adjustment. You can add that idea here. We also have an idea tool for the different form types. As Corkett mentioned, each one of these form zones comes with a catalog of different form types that are permitted within. Maybe when you're analyzing it, you realize, hey, I get what you're trying to do here. You're trying to limit the form zones in the core. I think you went a little bit too far, or you didn't go far enough, and there are some form zones that you have described in this chapter that should be included here. That's the type of feedback we would really like to hear. Then we have another idea tool for the zoning process. We're sort of realigning how we do processes now. That information is contained at the back of the chapter, and we would like to hear from you as far as that is concerned. And then finally, we just have a general comments. Maybe you have a comment that doesn't fit within any of those categories. You can use this space to leave that feedback here. Last but not least, my information is provided on this website. If you would like to speak with staff directly and cannot make the 4 o'clock meeting time, please email me and we can work something out for you. We still have information about sort of Planning 101 included in this website, general questions about zoning in case you're somewhat unfamiliar with the concept in general. There are some resources here for you to take advantage of. All right, so we're going to enter into our Q&A session now. And I'm going to show you how we have thought to arrange that. So let me share this in full screen, and I'll switch this over so that it is full screen. Okay, so this should be generally what you see in your WebEx screen right now. At least this is what I see in my software. You've got the different faces of the panelists making the presentation, and then you have a couple options on the bottom right. If you have the participant tab activated, you should see a list of all the panelists that are including in this meeting, as well as your own name. If you do not see this column, click on this participant tab. Now, what that does is it brings up the option to raise your virtual hand, which is located at the bottom right-hand corner. And if you don't see it here, you can try hovering over your name and the option might be right there too. What we're asking people to do is if you have a question, please hit that raise hand button now. And then our meeting host will go through each name one by one. We'll bring you into the meeting so that you can ask your question and have a dialogue with the panelists and any follow-up questions that you might have as well. And then we'll move down the list so that we can make sure that everybody has the opportunity to ask a question. If you have any difficulties with that on the technical level, you can also try using the chat to contact Stephanie, who is the meeting host, and she can try to hopefully help you out to get that taken care of. So I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to see if we have success. If you have a question, please try raising that little virtual hand button. I see one already.
All right. I will unmute William O'Brien.
One other thing I'd like to say, if you prefer not to verbalize your question, just indicate in the chat and we'll let you type it out and we can read it out for you as well.
Yeah, this is Bill O'Brien. First of all, thank you for your presentation tonight. I very much enjoy the level of detail and work you've all put into it. Okay, so I'm curious about the implications of this rewrite on what I would call potential adverse stressors to the city. So what do I mean by stressors? So these are the things that might have an adverse effect on the character of the city. So, for example, could these code changes encourage or accelerate population growth beyond what is currently going on right now? If there is that kind of population growth, how does that affect water use and needs of the city, especially during times of drought? And it was about 10 years ago, we actually had a forest fire encroaching the city, came pretty close to my own home. And you do need water to put out those fires. And of course, sadly, we've had a major set of fires in California. So be curious if this rewrite is addressing these kind of stressors. And I'll add one more to that. If you do have this kind of population growth, did you all take into account traffic congestion, traffic bottlenecks that might be associated with where the new construction might be, especially if it's high density construction? So again, thank you all, and I'm looking forward to your response.
Well, we can take turns taking these questions. I can start with this one perhaps. I think this was not this code rewrite was really approaching how development is expressed in Golden, not really focusing on population growth or not population growth. We are trying to gear the form of development to the context of where it is actually occurring. So I would say it's neutral on that subject. It is, as I'm sure most people on the call know, we have a 1% growth ordinance. So growth is already capped at 1%, and we have been below that for the duration of that period. It's averaging just over 0.8% growth rate over the years since 1996 when it was established. So I don't expect that to change. I think this again is more about the form and character of the development that does occur. It's agreed that water resources are always important to manage well, and we have staff that are working to do that and address those issues. But I think this is relatively neutral, is my response. Does anybody else have anything to add?
I think I would agree with that as well. I think that the way I look at it is the uses permitted within the zone district remain the same. And that the big change that comes with this new code draft is how those uses are arranged on the site. And so, for instance, in the R2, you're still permitted certain levels of residential density, but we're sort of trying to create this idea that you don't have to put it in a big box. You can break it out into several smaller boxes. And I feel that you would probably be in a situation where that is more difficult to express in a higher density situation than you would with a larger apartment building. I think that, as Cork had alluded to, these units will be small and their size will be strictly regulated. So I think I agree with Rick that this is sort of a neutral position. It's just sort of adjusting the way that a development is expressed. And often the situation is it works to reduce the overall size of that development.
Maybe I can add to that is that the way we see our role is that, those kind of big questions about the population growth, stressors, and et cetera, so forth, we're assuming that the policy documents of the town, the comp plan, the vision, addresses those. What we do, we look at those documents and try to understand the objectives stated there and if the current code is serving for those. If there's a mismatch, we try to fix that. And yeah.
I would just add also that, the update of the code and how an updated set of regulations apply is, there's sort of two parts to it. There's the zoning text, which is largely what we are talking about tonight. And then there's the zoning map, right? And the question, and they're separate questions about adopting a new code and then mapping or applying those new standards on the city zoning map and how it affects the potential of development, right? And so far, as Rick, Corey, and Orchid have mentioned, right, at least so far, the emphasis of the improvements to your current code has been on shaping new development that would be more consistent with the patterns found in existing neighborhoods. And as Corey discussed in terms of the use, the density, if you will, and as Corey reinforced, the density or the use range is not changed from what you have today. So unlike some other cities where we work, where the goal is actually to increase the capacity of housing and there's upzoning of land, at this point, this is not, I mean, that part of it is not part of the status of the work so far.
All right, I will bring in Don Cameron.
Okay, thank you. Gosh, I've got a lot of questions. Maybe I'll break it up. How about utilities? When I look at some of these multiple units on one lot, question comes to mind. If there's already an existing house, getting connected to sewer might be tricky. Do you have a plan for allowing lot splits, which will allow ownership? And if so, what's your vision on utilities, easements and things like that? That's one question. Another question is, what law needs to be changed so that we can address PUDs? What do I need to talk to my representatives about so we can change PUD zoning? Because I see that this completely ignores PUD. And I think that just puts stress on the same part of the city that has had stress for change. It's just fundamentally not fair. So I want to push on that. The other thing was looking at the forms. I noticed that there's still a lot of off-street parking required. Are you guys willing to talk about, at this time, not requiring as much off-street parking and fighting that off at the same time? So I'll leave it at that for now.
Well,
Sure. Thanks, Mr. Cameron. Orchid, would you like to, did you want to begin, or how would you want
sure,
to take this?
sure. In terms of the utilities, we had a lot of discussion with the public works and trying to figure out, the kind of easement you need to provide in different configurations. And, we, depending on the different types, I'm going to start with the compound where there's only one lot ownership. And it's no different than having an ADU. So you're not going to need a different easement because it's one ownership lot. It gets more complicated in the clusters when you create these lots at the rear. And we had a lot of discussion on those. And there are several ways to approach that. And still it's being discussed. One is that in a cluster situation, you're going to have an HOA. HOA is not going to own the separate lots and cottages. The HOA is going to own the common element, which is the common court and the parking. And since you're going to have an HOA, it's kind of like an apartment complex. The utilities within that particular common court is going to be a responsibility of the HOA. And with that, city backs out with some of the requirements because they're not going to go in and upkeep that. And again, it's kind of like a apartments complex. And especially if you don't have basements, and that means or you have a basement and then you pump, then the spacing of the utilities can be much tighter. In any case, even if you have to have a really large utility easement, because of the common court's geometry, you can actually provide that kind of easement. And, we looked at different options, different sites actually, and the different layouts, and there are ways to accommodate. Of course, each location, each case is a unique case, needs its own solution, but we're seeing a lot of possibilities still to create those kind of small lots and cottages. Now, PUDs bring their own regulations. What we're seeing here is that the framework and the form types, it's kind of like a vocabulary of form types, are available for any PUD owner. That is to say, if they want to have an amendment and pick some of these form types we're already providing, and form zones, it's going to make their lives much easier, because then you have a precedent of a by right framework that you can really adopt and go with that. So in terms of the PUDs, some are implemented, so they're going to stay. Some are not implemented, and there may be some future amendments. And we're hoping that the city can encourage the owners, the applicants, to use some of the tools that are already being adopted. So even though we're not rezoning, or we're not suggesting to rezone any of the PUDs right now, we're confident that the vocabulary of the tools we're providing is going to be very useful for any kind of PUD amendment in the future. And the parking. Boy, we hear all sorts of complaints about parking, so I'm not going to even get there, because, we heard not enough parking, we heard too many parking. What we did in terms of the parking, especially in downtown area, is we relaxed the parking for small businesses and small lots to encourage the diversity of the size of the buildings and diversity of the local businesses. So other than that, more or less we're following what the current code is requiring for the other parts of the town.
Yeah, and if I could just add to what Korkut said, just a couple items. One of the issues that has come up as well is the cost of tap fees associated with these different form types. And it's hard to talk about this until everyone has sort of read through the code. But the clusters, for example, which are the ownership opportunities with instead of having a one big building, it's broken up into small buildings. There's a courtyard, and those cluster type developments, even though they are separate structures, we have been working with our public works staff to come up with a study idea to study the utility rates for such clusters and figure out a more fair rate than, say, an individual structure. So this would be, since we're taking multifamily and breaking it into pieces, why not have the rates for those tap fees more akin to the multifamily rate structure, so that that's more affordable. We're keenly aware that we need to have more affordable options for people, and we're looking at every angle on how to make aspects of this type of development more affordable, or at least attainable housing, if not classically, affordable by definition. PUDs, again, those are difficult. They're very highly customized zone districts. Mr. Cameron was, I believe, on Planning Commission when we had an exercise where we looked at PUDs and tried to figure out a way to make them standard zone districts, and quickly realized that we would make everything non-conforming. But as Korkut said, we are looking for ways to encourage people, encourage those PUD holders to adopt this type of code, the options within this code, I should say, to carry that out and express that in the PUD areas of town as well. And then parking. Parking is a big one. This is something that staff would like to tackle more comprehensively in the future, hopefully in the nearer future, because yes, our parking regulations have not been really revamped in a very long time. We've made some adjustments for downtown in our CMU zone districts, but It has not really been looked at for many decades comprehensively. And this code doesn't take that issue head on. I will say that there are things that do change a little bit. So if you're looking at the clusters, again, that example of breaking things up into the cottages, our current code for single family homes requires one off-street space for a single family home. That's all. But for apartments and other multifamily, it's based on the number of bedrooms. So for those types of cluster developments that Corkett went over, what we're showing is one space per unit on one space per structure on those, and they are smaller structures, so I think it will work, but it isn't strictly based on the bedroom count the way it is now, which is sort of out of alignment with our single-family zone district parking requirements. So yes, there's a lot of work to do in conjunction with this code rewrite, and all of these things are sort of on various parallel tracks, in which we're trying to time them accordingly. But I think I'll hand it off to Corey.
I had one additional point to add to that question, Mr. Cameron, and it relates to the PUD. And I know that we've skipped around parking, PUD, and utilities. One of the things that we're considering to do is, as you know, we are working to update our neighborhood plans one by one. And as Corkett mentioned, with the creation of these form types, these options you can have for developments, it would, in my opinion, be a good idea to meet with each of these neighborhoods' residents and constituents and allow them to help generate some type of future land use map, which incorporates these form types. They get to select maybe which ones they feel are appropriate. And then that will allow us to, at least at the staff level, when someone comes to potentially amend a PUD, provide them with a list of form types that are desired within the community, the local community at that level, the neighborhood.
All right, I will unmute Michelle Minihan.
Hi, thank you. Thanks for this information. It's really interesting to see how the form-based codes have the potential to address some of the character concerns expressed by people in the community, but also provide flexibility. The way that I'm seeing it, I'm new to zoning code, but it seems like zoning code is only a part of the development solution. And I'm wondering if there's guidance that's being developed in conjunction with this to help the city use the code in conjunction with policies and permitting to promote some of the city's goals, such as sustainability, diversity, and affordable housing.
Yeah, I think that is part of this process. And I tried to allude to that in my portion of the presentation, that some of these topics that you mentioned are concurrent with this zoning code update. And we need to, at the staff level, work with those representatives within the community to incorporate as many of those items as we can. We know that our sustainability coordinator is working with her board to create a new approach to sustainability. Those will be ongoing conversations that occur over the course of the year. And we've agreed to work in tandem to make sure as many of those policies can be integrated into the new zoning code as possible. So that's sort of why I allude to the fact that, our consultants helped us get this far, and they'll help us get through a second draft too. But there's going to be time that needs to be taken to integrate some of those topics that you mentioned. And we need to be patient as far as their process is concerned, because it also incorporates other public outreach on their end, et cetera. But yes, that is definitely something that we are considering. On top of sustainability, also the Historic Preservation Board, as I mentioned, is considering new regulations. And we will work with those staff members and that board to integrate those regulations as best we can into the new zoning code. affordability is also something that is on the calendar this year. And we hoped to promote affordability with the form types that we are proposing. I'm wondering if Corkit, maybe you have some insight into providing this group ways in which some of these new ideas promote affordability.
Yeah. I mean, one thing that is interesting is that, we evolved the residential ownership as something that is just liability. You own a big house and you just pay money out of it. I mean, it doesn't produce anything. It doesn't create any income. It wasn't like that in the history. Not too far ago, there were a lot of small rental units, the ADUs, etc., really part of the fabric, and that created not only reasonable rent, but also provided income to the owner. So the compound idea is going back to that. That is to say, we don't need really big houses because it's really liability. A lot of the households, nowadays are getting smaller. They are doubling up because of the market. You only have large houses for sale, and you can really live in a 1,400 square feet and then have another one or two smaller units on the same lot and rent. Now, what this does to the other side is that, like I was saying, that what are the rental options today? Large apartment buildings, and it's not always the best living option for everybody. For some part of the population, living in an apartment is desirable if you're traveling a lot, if you're spending a lot of time outside of your house because of your work, etc., so forth. Then you don't need a lot of responsibility. But there's another segment of the population would like to live in a small unit, but a detached cottage, which is much more appealing and in a location where closer to certain amenities around. So, it's not just about the size and the price, but the location and the amenity and the lifestyle as well. That's why we're trying to diversify that. And also, it's the cluster idea is that, you can really have a small cottage. You don't need to park your car on the lot. You can just walk, 50, 60 feet and park in the alley and come to but you have a cottage, you have a building, you have a lot. And that also creates a whole different category of attainability. That is to say, you don't need to have a mansion, big 3,000 square feet, 5,000 square feet house, which is mostly what is available out there. We need to provide more really small lot, small unit options and different lifestyles within the neighborhoods, not out there somewhere in the, next to the mall. So that's the big picture of providing these options. And that's something listed in the objectives of the comprehensive plan as well in gold. Yes.
Yeah, I don't have anything specific to add to that. I just wanted to reiterate this is, attainable housing. More attainable housing is really one of the goals of all of this, and it's not subsidized market affordable. It's really creating the unit types that are more affordable and that are more in keeping with changes in our society. I mean, there's a census report out that says 25% or less of households by 2025 will have children living in those households. So the size of families or households has been dropping. It was 2.3 in Golden back in 2010. I suspect it'll likely drop again after this next census, and unless all the doubling up people will increase that. But it is we do have a mismatch between the size of our housing and the size of our households, and so this is meant to help address that.
All right, Tom Hoffman, I saw you had your hand up. Did you still have a question?
No, I think Don raised the issues. I know in our area, People seem to park near us and then they walk to another part of the neighborhood to their houses. So I think that is an issue, at least for us out here. But I think Don hit the points I was concerned about.
All right. And Kathleen Doyle, you are unmuted.
Yes, thank you. I'm coming to this late, so this was especially educational for me, and I really appreciate this. I like the concept of the use and form separation. That would never have occurred to me. I'm a lay person. Thank you very much. I do have a question. You mentioned, I think, the issue of discretion. This will take discretion out of this somewhat, in that if you choose the forms list for your use, it's pretty much streamlined process. Am I getting this concept correct? And what do you anticipate about then the process for someone going through this, making a proposal to build, and going through the process that they've been going through to now, with a lot of contention and public input and public arguments, versus what do you see in the future for that process? Do you see it speeding up? Do you see it being more friendly? I don't know how else to put that.
Well, ideally, I think we would see it as more predictable. I mean, I think if you are choosing from a catalog of options that the community has already seen and approved, then and there's no surprises, nothing different, then that would not need to have a public process. It would just be a matter of checking to make sure staff checking to make sure all of the codes were followed, and it's completely compliant with what our regulations state. There is a process, and maybe Corkett and Peter could go over that if you wanted to go outside of that, if you wanted some deviation from what those standard form types are. There's a special form, kind of a rezoning process, and that would be a public process. So maybe Corkett and Peter can explain a bit.
Yeah, so this is a really great question, and because right now, as we mentioned before, and I hope we made clear, your code is not delivering what you as a community desire, right? In fact, it's allowing things that, by right or even not by right, causes some conflict. So in some ways, you're pretty used to this notion of local oversight over any change in a neighborhood. Again, because over time, the city has created these processes, right, to engage that conversation. The idea here is, as we've described, we have looked carefully at the patterns of development and the scale and character of the neighborhoods, and calibrated new zones that would essentially, if you followed these standards, the product would be consistent with the neighborhood. And so that's the idea there is, so if someone were to follow the law and build something that is more sensitive in character to the neighborhood, the reward for that is greater certainty, predictability, and a faster ability to get a permit, right? And so, it's important to recognize that that is part of what's on the table and what's proposed, because, again, you don't have good standards to get what you want, and so you have a lot of process to it. If you believe and are confident in the standards and they'll deliver what you want, then it ought to be able to be quicker. Now, here's the advantage of that predictability. As a homeowner and a neighbor, I have a better idea of what could be built across the street and next door to me and behind me. Okay?
Right.
That's really important. As a builder or as a homeowner who wants to make an addition to their house, or a developer who's going to do an infill, I have greater certainty that if I follow these rules, I'll be able to get a very predictable process to get to my permit. And here's the thing about all of this, and it's an important perspective. If you care about the design quality of development, and if you care about affordability, and we've heard all the people that we talked to and what we've read that you've written in your plans, it sounds like people care about the design quality and the affordability of your community. In the process of a development, the more time that it takes to get to yes, the more money it costs to develop it.
Right.
And so what happens is, if you care about quality and you care about affordability, adding more process increases the cost of the development. And you might think, well, the developer will just eat that cost. No, they won't. They will just continue to raise the price to what they think the market will bear, and the resulting sale will be a more expensive product, right? And so this is the opportunity to sort of rethink sort of the system that you've been under with a code that doesn't deliver for your aspirations for the community. And so that's where we hope you all will sort of look at what's being proposed and how does it line up with what you've said in your adopted policy and your plans.
Great, thank you. Can I ask a follow-up question?
Yes, you may.
Okay, and this is different. I'm very pleased to see how this is developing, but it is developing. How are you handling current projects that are coming down the pike that need to get approved while we're developing this?
Well, the current code is still in place until this is adopted. So it is following the current code and the regulations that are in place until we get this approved, and it'll take a few more months to get there, I suspect. And so you know, to the degree we do have development between now and then, they will go through the current process.
Stephanie, could we get the next question?
Yes, sorry, my screen was frozen. Barb Warden, you are now unmuted.
Stephanie's mic volume was a little bit quiet, but I believe she said, Barb Warden, you are unmuted. She's still, oh, there we go.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
I get a little confused about the difference between the form zones and the use zones. And I'm wondering, a lot, or perhaps all of the R1 and RE neighborhoods are also shown as peripheral. And peripheral seems to involve some multi-house development. I'm wondering, does this mean that all the R1 and RE neighborhoods can now have 2 houses on their lots?
Should I jump in? The peripheral area is the single family detached area, and it's only the single detached structures are permitted there. So we have certain house types and smaller cottage types. What we're bringing there is that, you know, you may have smaller lots, and in some cases, on particular lot, there is some subdivision possibilities. So no duplexes, no larger multifamily buildings, and that's the character of that particular zone. You know, initially, our consultant team was not going to work on the single-family neighborhoods because basically we didn't hear any complaints in our interviews and, you know, survey. But the staff, as well as the task force, told us that we should really look at that and then try to guess potential issues in the future. So that's why we included that peripheral area. But in terms of the character, we're cognizant that it's a single-family detached neighborhood character, and we're not changing that character at all.
Corky, do you want to talk a little bit about the side house and where you can have that on larger lots or where you can have that on a corner? That is something that was added.
There's something called side drive house couple. Like I said, some lots may have a deeper configuration, and again, this came from staff that we're providing all these options, small cottages, clusters in other parts of the town. Why not giving some opportunity for the single-family areas, peripheral zone, basically? So we created one building form type where, if you have a large enough lot, you may subdivide the lot into two as long as you have space to provide utilities. So that idea that you may have a lot with no street frontage, we carried that opportunity in a limited way to peripheral zone as well with that house couple form type. Then again, if you're going to employ that, if you're going to subdivide, you need to make sure that there's enough space for utilities coming in from the street to the back of the lot that doesn't have the street frontage.
Right. I think the main opportunity is on those larger lots that Cork had mentioned, as well as on corner lots, and those are some options that Planning Commission has discussed in the past as well. And so we wanted to bring those forward and get input on those options.
I wanted to mention one thing really quickly. You mentioned that there was some confusion about the difference between the use map and the form map. And so I thought I would just bring this up briefly as an example. If you notice, if you follow my cursor, the shape that I'm drawing is essentially the current R2 zone district in the north neighborhood. And if you look at these little indicators, they say like T-R2, C-R2, those are the different form zones. So this greater boundary here is all of the R2 zone district. And what that means is no matter if you have a property in the light gray, in the middle gray, or the dark gray, you're permitted to construct the exact same uses. The difference with the form zone map is that if you are in perhaps C-R2, which is core, the disposition of the buildings, the size of the building forms will be characteristic of what exists currently in that area of R2. And since it's the core, we know that that is the least intense residential R2 use. The edge R2 right here is what currently I think Ruby Drive is, where you see those office buildings, etc. That's the most intense form of building that you can have in the R2 zone district. And then the transition area would be somewhere in between. I just thought that I look at these things visually. I just wanted to throw that out there in case that helps sort of distinguish the difference between the use R2 and then the form zone, which is core, transition, and edge. The thing that will be pivotal about all of this is our ability to update our digital parcel map that you find on our website. But we've had some discussions with our GIS team, and they've indicated that, at least for now, we'll be able to integrate the form zone map as a layer on top of the use zone map. But what will be great is that if you click on a parcel, or if you type your property location, your address in, it'll tell you what your use zone is, and then also what your form zone is. And it will provide you links to the associated PDFs so that you can reference what exactly is permitted on your property from a use perspective, and then also a form perspective. And that will be available before the code is adopted. Just wanted to add that in.
Yeah, maybe just one more element in that same vein. We are wanting to make this more usable, as we've said a number of times, and So the current documents don't have links that allow you to jump around to different contexts, but the future documents will. So it'll be much easier to, have these embedded links that allow you to move about the code accordingly as you need to. But right now it's mostly just a big document until we get a more complete draft. We don't want to put those kinds of links in yet.
All right. We had Stacy Park. I saw a hand up. Do you still have a question?
Hang on. I sent a question on the Q&A part of it. And what I would like to know is what is changing in the R3 zone to prevent three-story monstrosities to be built in a historic neighborhood? What will prevent a developer from building something that does not fit in the neighborhood?
Well, I think the answer to that question is a lot of things. One, and it sort of feeds into this analysis that the consultants indicated that they provided for where the form zones are related, that if they felt that there was an area of the city where they see those bigger buildings or where those buildings are perhaps more appropriate to occur, they'll draw the form zone around those areas so that that type of development proliferates in the appropriate area of the city, and it's not developing in an area that is more sensitive to that type of giant building next to smaller buildings. But in addition to that, I think that what's important about your review of this draft is that there was a lot of effort that went into replacing the big bad building with an option that perhaps provides the multi-use experience, but it's either broken into smaller units that are separate from one another, or it's provided in a version of that multi-unit experience, whether it be a duplex or a triplex. But the consultants did a lot of work to further reduce the size of that type of development option. So you might have a duplex that's permitted in your form zone, but pay special attention to whether or not it is a cottage duplex versus a standard duplex, because a cottage duplex was specifically written to regulate the square footage of the development to be very small.
Right. Exactly. No, I think that is a big change in this code. I think Corkett mentioned that previously, but we are taking a fairly bold step forward in limiting the size of structures. It's no longer just the setback from the property line or the height. It's much more than that. It's about actually limiting the size of these structures. So, and those are based on the area of town, those context form zones that we've been talking about. So there's quite a number of different controls that are meant to reduce that scale, that massing that's been the problem. That's really been the central problem with the newer development that's been going in. And those R2 and R3 zone districts are generally the core that you see when you see the form zone layer and you see core. That's what that is. And those types of structures that are allowed within, you can look at those specifically and give us feedback on whether or not you think those building types belong in that form zone area, those R2, R3 zone districts.
All right, we have a hand up from Carl. You are unmuted.
Hi, thanks very much for all the
careful work and involving the community here in the process. I live up here in the R2 north side of town, and I'm definitely concerned about the row house development.
Yeah, sorry.
So, can you hear me okay? Oh. Okay, I think you can hear me. So
yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thanks. So I live up here in R2. I'm concerned about the row house development, and I like the example you just gave, Corey, showing on the map CR2. Is there anything that could be done to make a sooner decision in parts of town that are really exhibiting a lot of clash due to current development? From a timeline point of view, I think we're looking at summer or fall before any code updates would be approved. So I'm just wondering if there could be a way to make a decision for affected areas sooner.
I'm not sure. I think that, you know, we can evaluate that topic when certainly this is reviewed with the Planning Commission and City Council as we start to enter the second draft phase. You know, we can lay out on the table to council, like, these are the elements of the code that we feel like have to be updated for this thing to properly jive. And I mentioned like a lot of extraneous, well, they're not extraneous because they're important, but there's a lot of additional work that we need to put into this process. You know, maybe City Council can make the determination that we need to get the meat and potatoes, so to speak, the information that's largely contained within the drafts that you see tonight in the eventual second draft, that needs to be adopted, and then we need to work on those additional elements later or after. But I really think that it would be important to get as much as we can into this new code at once, because if we don't do that, if we sort of rush review the process so that we can ensure that the scale of buildings are appropriate, we might shoot ourselves in the foot when it comes to sustainability. We might shoot ourselves in the foot when, as you know, some of your co-attendees mentioned, historic preservation is considered. So I think that it is important to get it right. Certainly when somebody comes in with a development proposal, we can take a look at the form map or the form zone map that we're putting together, seeing if there's conflict there, educating them on the type of developments that we propose for this area of the city moving forward, and work with them. As Peter mentioned, we have a lot of process right now, so hopefully we can rely on the existing code and its ability to potentially over-process to make sure that those types of developments are presented in a way that's more compatible with the community. But it sounds like this point has been brought up a couple times now, so it should be a point of conversation when we re-engage with Planning Commission and Council.
Yeah, I would agree with Corey. It's difficult to rush this process. We want to make sure we do this right. We hadn't contemplated doing it in more of a piecemeal fashion, and we could certainly look at that if that's where our city council wanted to go. But I understand that the desire to have this done sooner rather than later. But we'll do our best to move this process along. There's no we would never intentionally delay. But there is some analysis and some input that needs to happen from the community at large, and in order to make sure that we're getting this right. So there'll be enough code changes after this code is adopted to deal with. We want to minimize those up front as much as possible, and not create any negative impacts that we failed to foresee.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because as Corkett mentioned, the Chapter 1829 is over 100 pages. You know, there's a lot of information in there to review. And if we rush it and we approve it just to prevent maybe development X from coming into the city, we may have missed something important, and then development Y pops up 3 months later, and it's developing a form type that really isn't appropriate perhaps for that area of the neighborhood, and we missed it because we didn't take the careful time to fine-tooth comb the review and make sure that all of those elements are set in place.
All right, we have another question from Don Cameron.
Thank you. I dropped one question into the chat to Corcut directly. He can answer that separately, but I've got a separate thing. How many people do you need input from to get 3 cluster cottages added to peripheral? That's one question. The other question is, it goes back to what Barb asked, and on the map. I think that the key is fine. It does mention that the zone types and the peripheral, like the form types are on the map. But I think for people that are used to looking at the old zones, it needs to be really clear that you have essentially changed almost nothing. All you've done is overlaid form types that exist in these zone areas and said, we want to continue to see these form types with the exception of maybe transition and edge, where they might want to give a little bit more scrutiny. But I see this, my quick look at it is, it's about the same as what we've got. And so the reason I asked for the 3 cluster in peripheral is because I think it's a game changer for affordability. And finally, on the peripheral, this is, sorry, a little bit long question. I don't see ADU listed. So when I look at the form types in peripheral, tell me where ADUs are still allowed. All right, that's a lot. Thanks.
Yeah, I'll start and others can jump in. I think, yeah, that's great input to hear, Mr. Cameron. I think starting that conversation about 3 cluster in single family is a good thing to do. We have a guiding golden site to do that, and we'll see what others have to say as well. I think we're looking for all kinds of ideas, and we are definitely looking at expanding the amount of attainable housing. But of course, it's a community decision. So we'll see what kind of input we get. I think. What was the? I'm blanking on the last question now. Sorry. If someone wants to jump in and answer the second part.
ADUs.
Oh, ADUs, right. Yeah, ADUs are still defined in 1828, but they can go into the form that's in the peripheral zone districts. So ADUs are still meant for these single-family zone districts, but they can be represented in the form types that are shown under that, suburban house and so forth, that are listed under the peripheral zone district. So it's still there and it's still available. When we talk about the cluster for peripheral, we're talking about ownership specifically. With ADU, it's of course still it would still be all one owner, with the ADU portion functioning just as it does today, expressed in the ways that it's allowed in those building forms.
I just want to add that, the compound concept is actually multiple ADUs. Basically, it works that way, multiple small structures. Now, in terms of, maybe I misunderstood you, but you said, not much change in the R2 and R3. Actually, the core right now does not allow triplex, fourplex, just single structure and duplex. That's a big shift. That is to say, we observe that the core areas, and it's both the same for R2 or R3, it doesn't matter. Core is giving you this same menu of form types. And that's pretty restrictive. And that's the reason we're suggesting is that we consistently saw on those neighborhoods that the structures are small and more traditional, and there's that scale, that is to say, 1.5 story scale was dominant. There are some 2 stories, but there are always, traditionally, there are a lot of cases where the second story is built into an attic and the general scale is pretty cozy. So that is the reason why, we saw that in those core areas, we see a lot of the problems in terms of the new developments getting in and creating incompatibility. So that is significant. And then you go out to the transition and edge, those areas where you see a lot of diversity of sizes and building types.
All right, we have another question from Bill O'Brien.
Thank you. I have a follow-up question regarding the issue of parking in the street. Especially in the context of streets that can become pretty narrow because of parking on each side. Where in fact you really have a street now that is probably only wide enough for three vehicles. So the reason I bring this up is because to me, safety now becomes an important issue in the context of how you write your code, especially with neighborhood kids, bicyclists. Kids being kids, they'll take their bicycle in between parked vehicles, and they may not be aware of a speeding vehicle coming their way. God forbid anything should happen to them. My point is, gentlemen, please somehow incorporate safety in your mindset when you're actually trying to develop these code changes. The safety of our neighborhoods are absolutely paramount, especially with our kids. And in my neighborhood in particular, the kids are going up and down that street all the time with their bicycles. Please try and at least address that, be aware of it. If you do, I think the entire city of Golden will be grateful to your efforts. Thank you, gentlemen.
I'll just jump in. I think, the parking, the street width, and the speed, those are all matters of the transportation plan. The zoning mostly deals with what's going on with private property, and in terms of the parking, we regulate the off-street parking. So in this particular study, we really didn't do an analysis of the existing streets and the parking and such. But, being an urbanist, I'm just going to make an observation. There are a lot of studies about the fatality and accidents and the speed of the traffic, especially in neighborhoods, residential neighborhoods. And interestingly enough, on-street parking reduces the traffic, the speed. It's a very good speed control. That is to say, if you have a narrow street, on-street parking, the speed really goes down. And that's what usually we, the planners and urbanists try to do, to reduce the speed. And, in a counterintuitive way, if the road is narrow, people don't go fast. Therefore, it's safer. So that's just an observation I wanted to add. But like I said, that's beyond our scope in this particular effort of rezoning.
Yeah, thanks, Corkett. I agree. I mean, in Mr. Bryan, safety is always a top concern. That's one of our core missions as city staff. We recognize your concern, and I will say that Corkett has a strong point there. Our traffic engineers would say the same thing, that on-street parking is actually traffic calming. It's a measure of traffic calming that happens naturally. But your point about safety overall and in how we look at parking and going forward is noted. So thank you for your comment. I just wanted to say we have to wrap up very soon. We're already a little bit over, and we're going to be bumped by another program very soon on Channel 8. So I would suggest we have time for 2 more questions, and then we should really close it down. And then Corey can then remind everyone about the about our office hours going forward and our other options for engagement.
We have one more question from Barb Warden, and then nobody else has their hand raised or any chats. So, Barb Warden.
Can you hear me right now?
Yes.
Okay. All right. I still wanted to clarify the R1 question. I appreciate, Corey, you're telling me about the map that's going to further define what kind of forms can go into certain areas. Does that mean that within R1 and RE, you will go through and you'll say which lots can have 2 houses and which cannot?
Well, I was going to say there are only very specific circumstances. I'm getting feedback. Hopefully everybody's not hearing that as well. But there are only specific circumstances where you can have more than 1 unit currently. So you can have a second unit, a second lot, I should say, only on those larger lots and on those corner lots that we described earlier. But yes, the form types that you're speaking of are represented for each form zone area. So for peripheral, there are a whole set of form types that are listed, and you can look each one of those up and see what it looks like. So that's a great opportunity for you to do an evaluation and tell us what you think belongs and doesn't belong, which one of these things doesn't belong. And that's a great way to give us feedback.
Okay, so I assume that a lot of the lots in, say, Beverly Heights, which tend to be RE, are wide enough that they could have those second houses, the side drive houses. So my question was, will your form map show all of those? Or are you saying that individual homeowners will have to evaluate whether they fit the criteria or not?
Right, correct, the latter. So it would be theoretically available, but it would depend on the lot configuration and the size. So they would have to look at that, and then they can ask staff for guidance. But yes, it would be a potential opportunity that they could explore.
All right. Can you, on Guiding Golden, provide the dimensions for which lots would be eligible for that? For instance, if it's 150 feet wide, does that mean a lot is eligible? Or any corner? Just tell us what the criteria are to make that possible, please.
Yeah, it's in the code. That is to say, 1829 now includes all those restrictions per permitted form type. So if you go through, there are 6-7 form types permitted in that particular zone district. And if you go through those pages, each page will tell you minimum lot size and the frontage requirements, etc., so forth. Here it is. There's the house. Go forward. Maybe we can show the this particular one that you're asking. So minimum lot size. Oh, you passed it. If you can go back to that one. In order to do this particular configuration, you need to have minimum lot size that is 6,000 square feet, and that's also provided in the document.
So if there is a 6,000 square foot lot in an R1 or RE neighborhood, they could put, this looks like 4 houses on it?
Before the subdivision, this particular configuration has 2 lots, a corner lot and an inner lot. And then each one of them subdivided to add another lot, and that's how we ended up on these previously 2 lots became 4 lots now. So the reason we call this side drive couple is that a single lot then subdivided into two. And the reason we're showing a corner as well as the inner is that those are different configurations. We usually, if you go back, for instance, one page up, again, you know, these are single family houses. We show a corner situation and an inner situation so that both configurations are covered. That's why you're seeing 4 buildings on the next one, to show what happens in the corner situation, what happens in the inner situation.
Okay,
Right,
thank you.
so the diagrams are meant to provide examples, but the regulations that are listed on the right-hand side are for one of these configurations. But one of the things that's important to sort of point out as we look at this is that what this code does better than the previous code is that it starts to apply maximum floor areas to these developments. Maximum lot coverages. Maximum lot coverages were applied to certain zone districts, but not all. Things like limiting the number of stories that a household can have, those types of things. So again, we encourage you to sort of look at this, look at actually what's being regulated, because there are multiple facets of the development that are now being regulated, where before we just had, like Rick mentioned, the bulk plane, which was the glass box, which basically meant that you're only eliminating massing off of the edges of the house. Now we're looking at the properties in 360 dimensions, and we're saying, okay, we need to make sure that there are certain accommodations for all sides of the house in a lot of different contexts.
So you were mentioning that very large houses would no longer be allowed, and I'm thinking about some of the neighborhoods where we have some of our bigger houses like Stonebridge and whatever that is on the west side of Highway 93. Does that mean that neighborhoods like that would no longer be allowed?
Well, those are PUD zone districts, so they aren't directly impacted by what we're doing now. But if we adopted some of these form zones for those PUDs in the future, that would be true.
I mean, the way we look at it is how sensitive is the neighborhood currently? That is to say, if you're developing somewhere in the periphery, you're kind of by yourself, that's a different story than you're in a neighborhood where the biggest house is actually, let's say, 3,200 square feet. So the current code permits you to do bigger houses, especially if you have a larger lot. That's where we're seeing that, if the majority of the structures, actually predominantly the structures are smaller structures in that particular neighborhood, we should put a limit somewhere so that we prevent the Frankenstein big houses. Basically, that's what it is.
Okay. Well, we should wrap things up here. We're like I said, we're running out of our overrun time. So, Corey, do you want to remind everybody of our outreach opportunities? I'll just plug one before I pass it to you. There is a Coffee with the Counselor event on February 4th. That's Saturday at 10 a.m. And we will be talking about this. I'll be there. And we'll be talking about the code rewrite with counselors. And those details can be found on the city event calendar on our webpage.
Yeah, so just really quickly, I showed you the Guiding Golden page earlier in the presentation, but we're really going to rely on the comment fields, those idea tools that are on Guiding Golden that have been broken up into different categories with a final category for just general comments. We really would like you to take advantage of those so that anybody exploring the Guiding Golden website that may not be as familiar with zoning as some can see the types of comments that people are leaving, and they can react to those, and they can help those. Those comments tend to help people form their own ideas when looking at information like that. We're also going to have our staff weekly office hours, which is provided in a WebEx link on Guiding Golden. This will be every Thursday at 4 p.m. Again, you'll be able to download copies of the various chapters within the zoning code draft And then my information is pasted there as well. If you need any additional information or you need me to clarify anything, please take advantage of that as well. We're going to have this outreach process open for the next 4 to 5 weeks throughout the course of February. So we look forward to talking with all of you.
Yeah, and this meeting will be recorded and on Guiding Golden as well, so you can take a look at this in the future, tell your friends, and just send any questions our way, or feel free to come to those office hours again. You know, all levels of understanding of zoning are welcome. We note there are no stupid questions. We would love to hear your questions and your input. So I'm looking forward to that.
Thank you, everyone. I appreciate everybody's participation tonight. I enjoy the dialogue, and as I mentioned, we look forward to engaging with you in the future. Check out social media. We're going to have a lot of notifications going out to try to get people involved, spread the word to your neighbors. We look forward to engaging with them as well. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.